I'm going to talk to you about the principle of constitutionalism and the different ways in which it is implemented in different legal systems. The principle of constitutionalism requires that government power be limited and its exercise controlled. The limits on government power operate as higher or constitutional legal principles. You can see there's a very close link here between the concept of constitutionalism and the concept of the rule of law that we looked at previously. Though this is a really important concept, it is a very broad one, and there are many different ways of pursuing this principle of constitutionalism. More specifically, there are many different constitutional models across the world. I'm going to start by explaining some of the more specific or discrete differences between constitutional models before talking about the more fundamental differences that they reveal. The first difference is that some legal systems have written constitutions, whereas others do not. That is, in some legal systems you can go and find a written instrument that sets out the constitutional rules that apply in that legal system. Australia is an example of this. We have an Australian constitution. We also have constitutions at the state level. But not every legal system is like this. The United Kingdom is perhaps the best example of a legal system without a written constitution. What this means is that there is no one written instrument that sets out all the constitutional rules that apply in the United Kingdom. Most of the constitutional rules that apply in the United Kingdom are what we call conventions. These are customs or practices that have developed over time. They weren't established by a written instrument, and for the most part, they haven't been codified or enshrined in a written instrument. They are flexible and can change as custom and practice changes. Another really important difference between different constitutional models is that some legal systems have rigid constitutional rules, whereas in other legal systems, the constitutional rules are flexible. To give you an example of that, the Australian Constitution is a rigid constitution. It cannot be changed easily or in the same way as other laws. In fact, the Constitution sets out its own very limited procedure for how it can be changed. You can find this in section 128 of the Constitution. Speaking generally, it states that the Constitution can only be changed if that change is approved by a majority of people in a majority of the Australian states at a referendum. This is a very difficult hurdle to satisfy in order to change the constitutional text. So we say that the Australian Constitution is rigid. It can be changed, it is possible to change it, but difficult to do so. In other legal systems, the constitutional rules are far more flexible. The constitutions of the Australian states are an example of this. Most state constitutions are just ordinary pieces of legislation that can be changed or repealed in the same way as any other act. For example, if the Victorian Parliament wishes to change the Victorian Constitution, it can do so by just enacting an ordinary statute during the ordinary course of parliamentary activity. It doesn't require a referendum. There is one limit on that, which you'll learn about in constitutional law, but we don't go into detail in this course. You might also have noticed that when I was talking about the constitutional rules of the United Kingdom, I mentioned that they were flexible too. That's partly because those constitutional rules consist primarily of conventions that aren't laid out in any one codified written instrument, so they can change as practice and convention change. The final discrete difference that I want to mention to you is the difference between the content of constitutional rules in different legal systems. That is, the nature of the constitutional rules to which government is subject. One of the most visible constitutional differences between Australia and other legal systems is that our Constitution does not contain a Bill of Rights. If you look through the Australian Constitution, you won't find many provisions protecting individual liberties or rights or preventing the government from acting in a way that's contrary to your interests. That can be contrasted to, for example, the Constitution of the United States, which contains a lengthy Bill of Rights, setting out things that the government cannot do or individual interests that are protected from government incursion. Another example is in Australia. The Australian Constitution requires a strict separation between the judicial branch and the other branches of government, or in other words, the judicial power of the Commonwealth is strictly separated from the executive and legislative powers. We're going to talk a lot about the separation of the judicial power later in this course. On the other hand, there's no separation between the legislative and executive branches. In fact, they overlap. Executive ministers, which form part of the executive branch, must also be members of Parliament, so they perform a dual role. We will also learn about the fact that Parliament can delegate some of its lawmaking powers to the executive branch. So those two branches of government are in a way fused or overlap. This is very similar to the position in the United Kingdom, where we inherited that system of responsible government. By responsible government, we mean that executive ministers are part of Parliament and answerable to Parliament. And we'll look more at that later in this course. That's very different to, for example, the position in the United States, where the Constitution mandates a strict separation between all three branches of government. Now, they are three examples of the way that the constitutional models in place across the world differ. And they really speak to more fundamental differences in the nature of constitutionalism itself. There are many different ways that we could frame this difference, but one way of thinking about it is as a difference between legal and political constitutionalism. Political constitutionalism entails that public power is primarily constituted and constrained by political rather than legal rules. In a political constitutional model, the primary source of constitutional principles is convention, that is, practice or custom that has developed over time. They are not, as we've seen, set out in a codified text. They are the product of evolution, convention, and compromise. These conventions can change, and importantly, they are not legally enforceable. A convention is a political rule. The sanction for breaching a convention is a political one. You might be criticised or challenged by your political colleagues. You might be criticised by the electorate at the next election. But conventions are not enforceable by the courts. So, if you feel that the government has acted contrary to convention, you probably can't go to the High Court and ask it to invalidate the government's action, because a convention is not a legal rule that the court recognises. In other words, in a political constitutional model, the courts do not play a primary role in controlling the exercise of public power. The control of the exercise of public power is primarily entrusted to the political process. In a political constitutional model, the limits are, in a sense, self-policing. The United Kingdom is again a really good example of a primarily political model of constitutionalism. As we'll learn later in this course, it's generally accepted in the United Kingdom that there are no legal limits on Parliament's powers. The Parliament in Westminster can enact whatever laws it thinks fit. The court has, in theory, no power to strike down legislation, for example, on the basis that it's contrary to common law principles. This doesn't mean that there are no expectations about what Parliament should and shouldn't do, or no conventions that it has to comply with. There are. The UK is populated by a rich set of political conventions, but those conventions are not enforceable by the courts. To give you a really clear example of what I'm talking about here, some of you might be aware that in the United Kingdom there are multiple levels of government. There is the government that is situated in Westminster, and then there are what we call devolved governments in Wales and Scotland. Over time, it's been established that the Parliament in Westminster should be respectful of the wishes of, for example, the Scottish people, and entrust them a degree of autonomy as to how they are going to be governed. It is therefore a convention that when the Parliament in Westminster enacts laws that affect the people of Scotland, they will consult with Scotland. But that's merely a convention. It's not enforceable in the courts. So that's political constitutionalism. The contrast here is legal constitutionalism. In a legal constitutional model, public power is primarily constrained by positive law, which is enforceable by the courts. Most of these principles are found in a legal instrument like a written constitution. And in this system, the courts play really the primary role in controlling the exercise of government power. How does Australia fit into this scheme? Australia has a really distinctive mix of legal and political constitutionalism, especially at the federal level. As we've seen previously, the powers of the federal government are subject to legal limitations. Most of those legal limitations are judicially enforceable. You can go to the courts and ask for a remedy if you think that the government has breached them. But those limits are relatively thin. They still allow the government significant leeway to act as it thinks is in the best interest of the country. To reiterate, a good example of that is the fact that the government is not legally required to act conformably with human rights. If you think that the government has acted contrary to human rights, the primary remedy available to you is the political process. You might protest, you might make a complaint to your local member of parliament, or ultimately you might vote for a different member of parliament at the next election. But it's not a constitutional requirement of law that the government act conformably with human rights. So we have a system in which there are legal limits on government power, but they're relatively few and thin. This is a mix of legal and political constitutionalism. This mix reflects the historical origins of the Australian constitutional order. The framers of the Australian Constitution, the people who wrote the instrument that was ultimately approved by the people of the colonies and enacted as the Australian Constitution, were really wedded to the old British idea that the political process could be relied upon to guard against unfair, unjust, or otherwise undesirable government action, that it was not really necessary to involve the courts. This is really based on an idea that if government is elected and accountable to the people through the political process, then it's not going to act in a way that the people disapprove of. But of course, you might question whether you think that's a legitimate view. So the framers were quite committed to that idea that legal limits on government power were theoretically unnecessary or undesirable. However, that ideal was necessarily compromised in the Australian legal context, because Australia is a federal system of government. As you learned about in FOL, Australia, what we now call Australia, initially comprised of a set of colonies. Over time, each of those colonies developed their own sense of colonial identity. They jealously guarded their own interests. In order to convince those colonies to join together into a federation, it was necessary to assure them that their interests were not going to be overborne by an all-powerful new federal government. Otherwise, they probably would have preferred to just stay by themselves. Furthermore, it was always understood that in order to make a well-functioning federal system, you had to divide power between the federal and state governments. Otherwise, you wouldn't really have a true federation. All power would be concentrated in the centre. So for those reasons, the framers departed in many ways from the British constitutional model. They drafted a constitution which it was always understood would be the primary source of Australia's constitutional rules. They also made it very hard for that constitution to be altered, as we've seen in section 128. That constitution sets out rules that constrain the exercise of public power in order to create a functioning federation. So you can see that Australia's mix of legal and political constitutionalism reflects those historical origins and the nature of the Australian federal system. In class, we're going to talk further about the differences between these different constitutional models that I have discussed and the potential benefits and detriments of each of them.